Good afternoon. My name is Ed Eck, and I'm pleased on behalf of the law school to welcome you to this Judge James R. Browning lecture. Before we get underway, we know, and I just want to repeat, that events like this don't happen because of the endeavors of a single person. They happen because of a number of individuals, and I would like to acknowledge collectively the staff and editors of the Montana Law Review. Thank you for making this possible. And their advisor, Professor Martin Burke. And of course, our honored speaker, Professor Strickland. We are fortunate to have this lecture series in honor of an alumnus of our school, Judge James R. Browning, and we are fortunate this morning that one of his former clerks, Professor Elaine Gagliardi, is going to share a little bit with us about Judge Browning. Elaine.
Welcome. I'm pleased to be able to say a few words about Judge Browning. I think I need to lower this. Some would say that Judge Browning's rise to prominence began in 1940 when he and his fellow law students took the initiative to actually begin the Montana Law Review. Certainly that is one of the achievements that to this day Judge Browning is most proud of. But as you know, he is a man who has had many achievements. He has done this because he's devoted his life to the improvement of the law and the efficient and fair administration of our legal system. He's had a career of public service, and it began for Judge Browning with the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice. And later he served as the Executive Assistant Attorney General, the Executive Assistant to the Attorney General of the United States. He was then appointed as clerk of the United States Supreme Court in 1958, and in 1961, President Kennedy appointed him to the Circuit Court of Appeals. This year, Judge Browning celebrates his 46th year on the bench, and that is the longest tenure of any Ninth Circuit judge. Two words in my mind best describe Judge Browning, and those are innovator and visionary. As Chief Judge, he was a leader among the circuits. He instituted the first complete computerized docketing system in a federal court to assist with case processing and control, and he did this at a time when many people had not yet even seen a computer. When he found that cases were backing up because of certain rules and the way bankruptcy cases were handled, he took the initiative to institute model rules for the operation of the bankruptcy courts, and he was primarily responsible for instituting the bankruptcy appellate panel. As a leader, he emphasized the importance of two qualities, and those were inclusiveness and communication. And these qualities, in my estimation, were key in rebuffing all the attempts that were made to divide the Ninth Circuit during the years that Judge Browning was Chief Judge and the years that followed. On a more personal note, it was my privilege to be one of our many Montana graduates that Judge Browning has had clerk for him. And I think back to those years and all that Judge Browning taught his clerks, and he taught by example. And when I think of the most important things that I learned from him, I learned the importance of a positive attitude. He would always say, you know, with a positive attitude, you can accomplish anything. And he's right. I remember just by the way he acted, the importance of a smile. You know, when I think of Judge Browning, I always think of this, every picture you see of him, and every time you talk to him, He has this huge smile. And what it did is it made you feel comfortable. Everybody who walked into his office was immediately placed at ease, and that was so important. It just opened up communication. He taught me the importance of working hard. I was lucky to have clerked for 2 judges who taught me that, both Judge Jameson, who our library is named after, and Judge Browning. At the year that I clerked, there was never a day in the week when Judge Browning was not at his chambers. And finally, the most important thing that Judge Browning taught me is that whenever we make decisions, we have to make sure that we're making fair decisions. And in making those decisions, we have to resist any personal bias. And he always did that. It is fitting that the Montana Law Review has named its lecture series after one of its most distinguished editors-in-chief, and indeed one of the most distinguished jurists in the United States. I know that Judge Browning is very disappointed that he is missing the lecture today by Professor Strickland. I can assure you that he would be extremely pleased that Professor Strickland has been chosen as a Browning Distinguished Lecturer in Law. And I would like to introduce Nikki Ducheneau, who is a member of the Montana Law Review Editorial Board, and she will introduce Professor Strickland for us. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm glad all of you can be here. I'm really glad to see such a great crowd out here. On behalf of the Montana Law Review, I'm honored to present this year's annual Judge James R. Browning Distinguished Lecturer in Law, Professor Bernard Strickland. Professor Strickland is a native of Oklahoma. He is of Osage and Cherokee heritage. Currently, he is the Philip H. Knight Professor of Law at the University of Oregon School of Law. He has a BA from Northeastern State College. He has a JD from the University of Virginia, an MA from the University of Arkansas, and an SJD from the University of Virginia. Yesterday, I had the privilege of spending a long lunch visiting with Professor Strickland, and I got to know firsthand what an amazing and interesting person he is. And yesterday, when I went home to prepare this introduction, I was looking for really the perfect way to describe such a unique, amazing person that I met that day. And as I was looking for the perfect descriptor, I learned a new word, and I'm going to share that word with you today. I didn't know it until yesterday, and that word is a polymath, which I think is a great word, and it perfectly describes Professor Strickland. My dictionary defines a polymath as a person of great learning in several fields of study, the kind of person with an encyclopedic knowledge in many, many different subjects. And I believe that Professor Strickland is a true polymath. He has 44 major publications to his name. His areas of expertise include legal education, art, culture, literature, race relations, and history, as well as the law. He has several fine distinctions. Whoops. Excuse me. He has been the president of both the Association of the American Law Schools and the Law School Admissions Council, and he's the recipient of the Society of American Law Teachers Award and the American Bar Association Spirit of Excellence Award. However, Professor Strickland is best known for his contributions to federal Indian law. In fact, it was brought to my attention this morning that the May and June issue of Native Peoples Magazine, a major publication, has named Professor Strickland as one of the 10 most influential Indian lawyers in the country, which is a great honor, and it also includes our Professor Cross, which is also a great distinction. Professor Strickland is considered nationally and around the world to be what you might call the Dean of Federal Indian Law. He was integral in introducing federal Indian law to the legal curriculum in the schools around the nation. This school is one that certainly benefited from his pioneering work in that area. Notably, he is the former editor-in-chief of what we in the Indian country consider to be our Bible, if you will, the Cohen's Handbook of Federal Indian Law, which legal practitioners of Indian law and Indian legal scholars probably consult on a daily basis. It's that pivotal a text. Professor Strickland's contribution to the field paved the way for all of the teachers and students of Indian law in the country today. I really believe that that's true. One of the, I think, the most remarkable things about Professor Strickland is really his commitment and passion for teaching and mentoring. And I think that what is attests to his great work are his students with whom he has shared his wisdom and knowledge, who are all over the nation fighting for Indian rights in areas of prominence. Leaders of tribal nations, the sovereignty warriors, if you will, fighting in the Supreme Court for our tribal rights, the drafters of important legislation. So I would like you guys to join me in welcoming Professor Strickland.
Thank you very much. It is indeed a great honor for me to be here and have the opportunity to deliver this lecture. I have great affection for Montana, for the law school, and for the lawyers that Montana has produced. All of you know, of course, the historic role that Marge Brown played in the creation of the modern Indian lawyer movement, and especially the relationship between law schools, tribal courts, and clinical leadership. On Monday of this week, I delivered a lecture in Rochester, New York, and only a fool would think that one could get from Rochester to Missoula in one day. I was that fool. But the meeting in Rochester and the lecture there was climaxed by a discussion, and one of the Indian lawyers who was there said, "You're going to Montana. That's where Marge Brown was." And I thought, you know, this is more than halfway across the country. It's more than a few years since her work, but someone in the Indian community remembers this contribution. And then at a more personal level, one of the most significant figures in my academic and professional career was a Montanan, Carl McFarland. And many people do not know that it was Carl McFarland who said to Felix Cohen, when Cohen came to work in the Justice Department, "Don't you think somebody ought to bring all of that Indian law together?" And at McFarland's assignment, Cohen undertook the task of doing the research on the Handbook of Federal Indian Law. Carl was also the director of my SJD dissertation. And he gave me one piece of advice, which I always give to people whose dissertation committees I sit on. He said, "You know, Felix Frankfurter directed my dissertation at Harvard." And I said, "Well, Professor McFarland," he said, "and I want to tell you, I want to give you the one piece of advice that Felix Frankfurter gave me." And I thought, oh, it's coming. I will now have the secret. And he said, "Frankfurter told me to get on with it. That hopefully in your life you do something that was more important than your dissertation." So it is a great personal and professional honor for me to be here to deliver this lecture. The title, "The Book and the Bow, the Courtroom as Battlefield for Native American Briefcase Warriors," comes from an Indian myth recorded at the end of the 19th century by Emmett Starr. Starr, an early Native American medical doctor, was caught in the transition from from tribal nationhood to state citizenship. He was a man whose world was destroyed by the Dawes Commission and the late 19th and early 20th century allotment of Indian land. His Cherokee Nation was legislated out of existence, he and his contemporaries believed, as surely as if it had been bombed from the face of the earth. To Starr and other Indians of that generation, the end of recognized tribal nationhood and absorption into a white state was a catastrophic blow, a blow from which many, including Starr, never recovered. When Starr died in self-imposed exile in a walk-up room in St. Louis in a boarding house, he left his tribal studies and an encyclopedic history as his legacy to Indian people. Starr's story of the Book and the Bow has become an inspiration to late 20th and 21st century American Indians who have recast the battlefields for national survival and produced a kind of tribal revival which Starr never dreamed possible. Among the new tribal leaders are several thousand Native American lawyers who have become known as briefcase warriors. The myth Starr provides a background not only for Indian lawyers, teachers, artists, doctors, and scientists, but for the entire Indian community seeking new weapons in the struggle, not only for survival, but for rebuilding and reaffirmations of traditional ways and values. In the beginning, the great creator gave Indian people the first choice of weapons, Starr notes. The Indian pondered the difficult decision of the book or the bow. After much deliberation, the Indian picked the bow. He chose the bow because it not only protected against enemies in battle, but provided food from the hunt. The white man was left with the book. Later, when the white man came, the natives realized the power of the book and the ideas it could contain. It was then that native people added the book to their growing storehouse of resources. Thus, the book became a primary weapon in the Native American struggle for survival. Change, symbolized by the shift from the book to the book from the bow, is central in the life of contemporary Native Americans, and its power is no more evident than in the courtroom and the administrative boardrooms where new Indian lawyers work their magic. More than 3 decades ago, toward the beginning of the new Indian lawyer movement, Judge Jerry Muscat provided and proclaimed that for Native people, law can be both a shield and a spear. There's a widely held ethnocentric view that the original inhabitants of North America were lawless. I give my students what I call the laundromat assignment. The heart of the laundromat assignment is that you have to go beyond the law school and talk to real people. When I used to work for a living and talk contracts, I would send my students out on the laundromat assignment to ask people, were oral contracts valid? In Indian law, I always ask my students if they'll go out and talk. And it doesn't have to be in a laundromat, but my students seem always to prefer a bar or a tavern as a place to talk with real people. But I ask them to get 5 words from people as to Indians. What do you know and think about Indians? And for a long time, one of those words that almost always appeared was lawless, along with savage. Now, of course, we get rich gaming and casino operators. But the truth of the matter is that pre-contact Native Americans had a very sophisticated legal order which varied substantially from tribe to tribe. There were important lawgivers, judges, clan spokesmen who fulfilled roles in those legal systems not unlike those of the lawyer in European common law and civil jurisdictions. A substantial effort by the young American Republic included the creation of civilized legal systems among Indians. Both George Washington and Thomas Jefferson lectured the southeastern Indian tribes on adoption of Anglo-based constitutions with separations of power and a strong judicial branch. The story of the transformation of these traditional systems is a remarkable testimony to the adaptability of American Indians, who often combined their traditional values with those borrowed from their white neighbors. I've been authorized under FCC regulations to have 3 plugs during the time I'm speaking for works of mine. So those of you who are interested in this period would find Fire in the Spirit, Law from Clan to Court, an exciting and no doubt stimulating read. The Cherokee experience has been widely studied and reflects their astute interest in law. As one early Indian lawmaker, Charles Hicks, explained, our very existence as a people depends on understanding the law. That was a statement from 1808. Numbers of tribes gradually began to create their own tribal leaders and leadership system, individuals who, while not trained in the formal structure of Anglo law, were familiar with its operations and details. Vine Deloria Jr. often imagined and described the highly sophisticated understanding of the law which 18th and 19th century Indian leaders had acquired. In fact, Vine and I frequently argued, and he maintained that in many ways, the mid-20th century tribal traditionalist, reading his copy of Cohen's Handbook of Federal Indian Law by a kerosene lantern, knew more about law than the recently graduated law school educated Indian barristers. And I suspect there was some truth in Vine's argument. There was never any question that these traditional Indian men and women knew their law. Occasionally one of them, these self-taught Indian lawyers, might be even admitted to practicing law in a state jurisdiction. For many others, we have elaborate records of their legal practice within the tribal jurisdictions and their use of the law to advance their tribal rights. To the best of our knowledge, the first Native American admitted to practice law in a state jurisdiction was John Rollin Ridge, the mixed-blood Cherokee poet and newspaperman who founded the Sacramento Bee in California in the era of the gold rush. In 1855, Ridge wrote to his uncle Stan Watie about studying and practicing law. It's an interesting, he was a failure as a gold miner, and he had to have something to do. He wrote, I will not practice the law unless I am driven to it. The general science of law I admire. Its everyday practice I dislike. But for the sake of having something upon which to rely, in case of necessity, I have patiently burned the midnight oil studying law. In speaking of his potential as an Indian attorney, Ridge observed that I may toil in the obscurity of some mountain village over the dull routine of an attorney. Ridge observed that I may toil, but I shall find a place to give the Indian a trumpet of his own. In addition to being a lawyer, as I said, he was the founding editor of the Sacramento Bee, which those of you who have any connection with California may realize to this day is the newspaper of record in the state capital. He was the author of the first major novel of California, The Life and Times of Joaquin Murrieta, and the first poet laureate of California. So in addition to being an Indian lawyer, he found some things to do with his life. Indian legal scholars and political scientists generally agree that 4 major diverse policy periods have emerged during the 20th century. They are allotment and assimilation from 1871 to 1928, Indian reorganization from 1928 to 1945, termination from 1945 to 1961, and self-determination from 1961 to the present. The contours of the first 3 periods were formed almost exclusively by legislative fiat. The government defined, rethought, and redefined the so-called trust responsibility during this time. In contrast, the present era of self-determination and tribal compacting had its beginning in the dynamic circumstances of the time when national legal services were first made available to citizens in regions designed as poverty-stricken, classically Indian reservation, where Western communities experienced phenomenal population growth and began to nudge toward tribal lands. With the modern Western movement, when renewed competition for the nation's natural resources focused increased attention on Indian land and Indian tribal energy resources. This policy era, by contrast, is characterized by the dramatic repositioning of the tribes and individual Indians from the passive role of ward, described by the Supreme Court in United States versus CAGMA, to that of the competent participant in commercial enterprises on tribal homelands and in capital ventures beyond tribal borders, and of course, on modern Indian gaming. The shift began in 1959 in the Supreme Court in Williams versus Lee, in which the court held that the Navajo Nation, not the state, had jurisdiction to hear contract matters that had been entered into on the reservation between a non-Indian and an Indian because of the right of the Navajo Nation to self-government. In the years following Williams, the practice of Indian law rapidly moved from discrete real property title matters handled in private law offices to the broader realm of constitutional law cases in federal court. As an aside, the first class in Indian law taught in a law school was in 1909 at the University of Oklahoma. And it was a course entitled Indian Land Title. And it dealt precisely and specifically with how you got land out of Indian hands into the public hands. When I taught at the University of Oklahoma, that was still a course which all students thought was required if you were going to take the Oklahoma bar. But they got quite a different course when I taught it. From what began as essentially a handful of government lawyers and legal scholars who were self-educated in Indian law principles in 1960, today lawyers who specialize in Indian law compose an impressive percentage of the practitioners in many states. Perry Beaver, the former principal chief of the Muskogee Creek Nation, sums up the transformation succinctly in a video being shown to the thousands of visitors to the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian in Washington. He says that 3 generations back, when Indian chiefs went to Washington, they took a war bonnet and a peace pipe. Now, he says, when I go to Washington, I take my briefcase and a couple of lawyers. In 1966, Dean Tom Christopher of the University of New Mexico School of Law and faculty member Fred M. Hart, later the dean of the law school, conducted a survey of law schools and state bar associations and determined that there were only 25 identifiable Indian attorneys and 15 Indian law students enrolled in the nation. Christopher enlisted Hart to develop an initiative for the University of New Mexico to increase the number of Indian students and thus the number of Indian lawyers in the nation. The outcome was the American Indian Law Center, housed at the University of New Mexico and charged with the administration of an intensive pre-law summer session for Indian students that simulated first-year law school experiences. Upon successful completion of the summer session, approximately 30 students each year were financially assisted by the center and gained admission to first-year classes at law schools throughout the nation, including the University of Montana. The center reports that approximately 1,140 potential Indian lawyers have completed the Pre-Law Summer Institute since 1984. And today they estimate 2,000 Indian lawyers work in all fields of Indian law. Other estimates, including self-declaration, suggest that there may be as many as 3,000 lawyers of some Indian tribal heritage. The collegiality, common sense of shared purpose, and the resulting Indian legal network is perhaps the greatest immeasurable benefit to the Indians who were participants in these programs. The first director of the American Indian Law Center was Robert La Follette Bennett, Commissioner of Indian Affairs from 1966 to 1969, and a highly respected Onondaga who had earned his law degree in the evenings while working in Washington, D.C. Under Commissioner Bennett's leadership, the mission of the center expanded beyond the pre-law summer session to the entire Indian community. Bennett engaged tribal leaders nationwide in dialogues concerning good governmental practices for tribes and assisted them in developing tribal codes and providing legal training to tribal judges, court personnel, and law enforcement officers. When Bennett retired in 1972, Philip S. Sam Deloria, a Standing Rock Sioux, was named director. Deloria had worked in Washington as well as in the OEO Legal Services Program on his reservation and brought to the center the perspective of reservation Indians. In addition, fulfilling the center's mission to prepare potential Indian lawyers through the Pre-Law Summer Institute, Deloria has established the center as an independent and informed policy voice in national Indian affairs and in international indigenous peoples matters. In the mid-1960s, the Office of Economic Opportunity established government funding for programs on or near many Indian reservations to provide legal services to the poor and disadvantaged. When it became apparent that legal matters were uniquely complex in that they were governed by a myriad of discrete federal statutes, treaties, regulations, administrative rulings, and court decisions, administrators of the public law program identified the need for a national Indian litigation organization to monitor and provide litigation support in important cases. In 1970, California Indian Legal Services, an OEO-funded program, obtained a Ford Foundation grant to implement a pilot project to provide legal services to Indians on a national level. The project was referred to as the Native American Rights Fund and has been known as NARF ever since. A year later, NARF incorporated with an all-Indian board of directors and moved its offices to a central location in Boulder, Colorado. That same year, the NARF board obtained funding from the Carnegie Corporation to establish the National Indian Law Library, a public law library devoted exclusively to federal Indian and tribal legal materials. The library is available to all practitioners in the field as well as scholars in the area of Indian law and history. The integrity of the library has made it a primary repository for tribal donations of unique and valuable documents. NARF staff of approximately 16 attorneys, 2/3 of whom are tribal members, seeks involvement in high-profile Indian cases that have precedential value in the area of preservation of tribal existence, protection of tribal natural resources, assertion of tribal treaty rights, education, health, housing, religious freedom, and accountability from federal and state governments. Almost immediately after incorporation in 1971, NARF attorneys became involved in the most controversial Indian case in the nation at that time, United States versus Washington, universally known as the fishing rights or the Judge Bolt decision. In 1970, the United States, on its own behalf and as trustees for several Western Washington tribes, filed the action against the state and its game and fish regulatory agencies and the Washington Reef Net Owners Association to enforce their off-reservation treaty rights to take their fish at their usual and accustomed grounds and stations. Attorneys for NARF represented 5 additional treaty tribes who intervened as plaintiffs in the case. In his landmark decision, Judge Bolt states that his objective was to finally settle what he characterized as more than a century of frequent and often violent controversies between state, commercial, and sports fishing officials and non-Indians on one side and tribal representatives and Indians on the other. The Bolt decision held that state officials may only regulate Indian fishing rights after the federal court was satisfied that, 1, the regulation is reasonable and necessary for the conservation of the fish species, and 2, only after the state's conservation measures have not been attained by restricting non-Indian fishing or Indian fishing only. The Bolt decision was upheld by the Ninth Circuit and tacitly by the Supreme Court. However, far from alleviating or even mitigating the dangerous situation, the community remained volatile for decades, and with it NARF's long-term involvement with the tribes. The 60s and 70s were a time of Indian law renaissance, and it was a national phenomenon. In 1971, J. Thomas Rowland, executive director of the Federal Bar Association, watched the practice of Indian law moving from a relatively small group of lawyers and administrative law judges employed by the federal government, mostly located in western states, to legal services attorneys and tribal attorneys across the entire nation, including the eastern seaboard. He identified the need for quality education programs for the Federal Bar Association members and the growing number of potentially new members that address the relevant common issues in Indian cases. He enlisted the assistance of former Commissioner of Indian Affairs Bennett to create a relevant curriculum and secure academics, practitioners who would come together at a national conference under the auspices of the Federal Bar Association. The first such national conference on Indian law was held in May 1976 in Phoenix, Arizona. The topics were tribal-state-federal relationship, development of energy resources on reservations, water rights, and the recently enacted Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. The attendance was approximately 150 people. Now, more than 3 decades later, the annual Federal Bar Association Conference continues to be the largest and most important Indian law conference in the nation, with approximately 750 attendees each year. In 1990, the Federal Bar Association created a section devoted to Indian law. Important committees on development of Indian law, with responsibilities for monitoring critical developments, were created. Many of your Indian law students from Montana will be in Albuquerque in 2 weeks for the next edition of the Federal Bar Association's Indian law meeting. If we had time, I would explore here the role of institutions, events, and individuals, such as individual law school programs, the presence of Native Americans as law professors, the addition of Indian law to a number of state bar examinations, the revision of the Cohen Handbook and its updating, the birth of graduate legal education in Indian law, as well as look at the substantial number of Indian lawyers who have emerged as tribal chiefs, assistant secretaries of the Interior, commissioners of Indian Affairs. But let me tell you, it will be all there in the book. This is my second ad. And as Montana students, professors, graduates, I think you will be proud of what your law school and your law students and your state has done as a part of this project. As I said, I am particularly grateful for this invitation because you forced me to work on a chapter of my current book, Spirit Red, Dispatches from the Heart of the Indian Nation. You know, I've always envied my literary colleagues who delivered chapters of their unfinished novels or their short stories as works in progress on such occasions. While this is not exactly a work in progress, or not as much progress as I'd like, this lecture provided an opportunity for me to look at what I have spent almost all of my post-decanal research time contemplating. The diverse campaigns in the Native Americans' historic battle for survival. Each campaign, whether legal, economic, cultural, or military, is worthy of a full-length book. In my work, I hope to bring them together in a unified analysis. Today, however, we will limit most of our exploration to the courtroom as battlefield. Change, symbolized by the shift from the book to the bow, is central to the life of contemporary Native Americans. The last 500 years, post-1492, probably brought more change to Native people than the previous 25,000. I was reminded of the length of tribal historic lineage at a recent potlatch hosted by the University of Oregon for the tribes that once occupied the land now considered the state of Oregon and the old Oregon Territory. The purpose of the celebratory thank you and giveaway was for the Rare Books and Archives Division of Knight Library and the university's anthropology department to present tribes with archival copies of their own historical records that were in Washington. As part of what was known as the SWAPLA project, Indian students helped collect tribal documents from the Smithsonian, the National Archives, and other governmental deposits. The ceremonial return of Oregon historic documents is rooted in the ancient Northwest giveaway or potlatch tradition. And what we did was have copies made for the Rare Books division of the library, but we had a second copy of all of those records made as a gift to the tribes so that the tribes would have their own archival copies of this important material. After accepting a truckload of paper, one Coos tribal leader responding, and I love university presidents, I've worked for a lot of them, and our president on this occasion said, "And we give you back your history." Not exactly what I would have chosen to have said to the tribes, but the man from the Coos reminded the gathering that they were most appreciative of these written records from the last 250 years, and that they would be very helpful to them. He said, but if you looked at the archaeological records of the area, you would know that the Coos have been on the coast of Oregon somewhere between 25 and 30,000 years. And that while it was a wonderful part of their history, some wouldn't think it was their best. And he said, based upon scientific findings, he said, Native people have occupied the North American continent for more than 800 generations. European occupants have been here, he noted, for 20, or perhaps, if you stretched it, 25 generations. So this noon, when we address the struggle, we're only talking about 500 years in terms of the Aboriginal experience. In fact, in terms of American Indians, you're really talking about current events. As the Kiowas would say, it is like the flash of a firefly in the night. It is but a very brief time. Nonetheless, these battles are important. And these battles take place every day. They take place in courtrooms. They take place on movie sets. You read them in your morning newspaper. They are in hospitals and clinics, in gaming casinos, in boarding school classrooms, as well as in the halls of Congress and over the water cooler in the BIA area offices in Oregon and Montana. Battlefields change. The weapons of the war, the tools of survival are diverse and ever evolving. And yet the spirit and goal of Native warriors, from Black Hawk to Salmon Vine Deloria, from Pocahontas to Pablito Velarde to Wilma Mankiller, remain much the same. There are many campaigns and battlefields, but only one war. It is the same war for survival, whether fought with book or bow, whether fought in the courtroom or fought in the operating room. In the fall of 2002, just before grade schoolers dressed up in their cardboard feathers and pilgrim hats for their annual Thanksgiving pageants, Naval Commander John Harrington became the first Native American in space. This Chickasaw, born in Oklahoma, raised in Colorado and Wyoming, orbited the Earth on the Space Shuttle Endeavour. In February of 2003, Commander Harrington, speaking to the National Congress of American Indians, described the thrill of looking down on the jewel that is Mother Earth. He passed over Indian lands and former tribal domains while playing on a traditional flute and watching eagle feathers he had brought on board float weightlessly. Thus the first Indian gazed from space on the homeland of America's native people. Hold that image in your mind, the picture of an Indian astronaut high above the earth. Now think back a little more than 5 centuries. From ocean-going galleons, Christopher Columbus and his European sailors saw new land and experienced similar amazement. They too glimpsed for the first time a remarkable jewel, the Americas. Juxtaposing these two portraits, we see Harrington walking in space, and this is literally, I'm inclined to be a little poetic, but this is literally true. He walked in space above the Caribbean where Columbus had stepped ashore the first time. In telling the story of Native Americans, the lives of countless men, women, and children from hundreds of tribes, villages, and bands come together as in a collage. More than 500 years of individual and tribal struggles taken as a whole comprise the Native American experience. And this is number 3. The book I am previewing today, Spirit Red, is written from that kaleidoscopic perspective. As Ralph Waldo Emerson observed, there is no history, only biography. Accepting Emerson's dictum, the best way to appreciate the Native story is through the events acted out in the lives of individual Americans. And there are no more interesting group of Native Americans than our briefcase warriors. Too often when we think about Indian people, we focus narrowly, almost exclusively on military battles and warriors, on so-called massacres and last stands. We envision blue-coated cavalry and feathered pony soldiers. In truth, the Indian struggle is broader, undertaken with diverse weapons in a constantly shifting arena. Spirit Red explores human conflict. It chronicles historic and contemporary stories of Indian conquest. This book is about a diverse people, the struggle of warriors, of judges, of chiefs. It records economic, medical, and scientific campaigns, the world of traders, doctors, and astronauts. Finally, it observes spiritual, cultural, and education clashes, the confrontations of priests, painters, and teachers. These battles are seen in the broader historical context of the lives of Native men, women, and children. It is their stories that are at the heart of the epics of discovery and westward expansion. It is their traditions that we hope to preserve. I hope that from these cases, I will be able to draw some significant questions. For example, I ask you to keep in mind Commander Harrington, who was charged with repair of the space shuttle, who was out there looking down. The dispatches about Commander Harrington and Admiral Columbus confront the reader with the idea of Indians in space and the possibility of response to a technologically advanced civilization in distant galaxies. I want you to think about, would the people of Earth be willing to have a race from a universe far, far away apply the same laws, treaties, and policies to Earthlings as Europeans applied to Native Americans? How would the United States or the Earth generally respond were it discovered by an advanced intergalactical civilization? Would U.S. citizens feel fairly treated if Martians or Venusian policy were directly copied from the Spanish colonial laws of discovery, from British trade policy, or even current United States Supreme Court decisions? The image of the Anglo-American herded into stockades built around the Washington Monument, waiting for removal to a less valuable planet, is a frightening flashback from the Native American experience and the policy which was neutrally known as Indian removal, relocation, and termination. If one is unwilling to consider science fiction questions, this issue can be explored in a different context. If natives became the dominant population group, there was a wonderful cartoon of about 30 years ago in the New Yorker that had a Navajo, around the Navajogan, and the caption of it was, "White women take birth control, Native women take America." The film, Return of the Country, turns the cinematic tables from white to red. Not an impossible scenario with the heavy immigration of Latin and South American people who are essentially of tribal heritage. An American Indian president, in Hicks' wonderful movie, appoints a commissioner of Caucasian affairs who is instructed, among other tasks, to acculturate little Anglo boys and girls into mainstream Native American culture. Following this historic Indian boarding school model, the children are removed from their backward influence of their Anglo parents and sent away to military-like academies where they are punished should they continue to speak the outlawed English language. The generational clashes during the last 500 years dwarf those of the previous 25,000. The most shocking change, of course, has been the collapse in the native population. The number of tribal people dropped from Russ Thornton's estimated 50 million in 1492 to only 250,000 in the 1890 census. Even the most conservative demographers acknowledge a 95% drop in native population over that 400 years. Remember that in the 15th and 16th century, Cahokia, the mound city in Illinois, was larger than London, Paris, or Rome. The cataclysmic drop in native numbers did not begin to reverse itself until the 1900 census. Indian population did not reach above 2 million until the 2000 census. The loss of tribal land and control of natural resources is equally dramatic. 5 centuries of such experience, including enforced acculturation loss and domination, raises haunting questions. Since September 11th, I've continued to return to D.H. Lawrence's declaration of, quote, the curse of America. Lawrence's observation is set forth in the novelist's oft-quoted passage. America hurts because the land has a powerful disintegrative influence. It is full of grinning, unappeased aboriginal demons, too, ghosts, and it is tense with latent violence and resistance. Yet one day, the demon of America must be placated. The ghost must be appeased. The spirit of place atoned for. Soon after September 11th, you may remember, Geronimo's picture was reprinted in newspapers across the country, captioned, "Geronimo was nation's first terrorist." What does that say about our ability to demonize, to understand or misunderstand those who can act in defense of home and family? Talk about the concept of homeland security. When I listen to television broadcasters reporting on the war in the Middle East and I hear about the maneuvering of Apache helicopters in Gulf War II, I wonder what Geronimo's response might have been. About a week or so before the start of the Second Gulf War, Secretary of State Colin Powell answered a question about the disposition of Iraqi oil fields. "We will," Powell declared, "hold them in trust for the benefit of the Iraqi people." This sent shudders down the spines of Native Americans, regardless of their political persuasion or their attitude about this war. For it was Chief Justice John Marshall who in 1829 formally denominated the historic, quote, trust relationship between the United States and the Indian nations. To him, it was like ward to guardian. Marshall then unleashed the trust doctrine, now the subject of the multi-billion-dollar Cabell lawsuit. Apparently, this ill-fated 19th century Indian doctrine of trust responsibility is to be applied in our 21st century Iraqi enterprises. It's not my intention to focus on the wisdom, morality, or legality of our current war, but to suggest that this moment in history provides a unique and ironic vantage point from which to look at the Native Americans' own first 500-year war. Today, I want us briefly to look beyond the military defeats and victories of Indian wars, beyond Wounded Knee, Sand Creek, the Smoked Meat Rebellion, and the Red Stick War. This lecture argues that the Native American struggle for survival has not been an isolated confrontation, but a single war with varied battlefields. Today, I believe we are in a legal phase of these actions. We too often miss the continuity of this native battle. We think of war as only a series of fixed military guerrilla-like operations. And yet the courtroom as battlefield is almost as old as the Indian struggle with the settlers, rooted in key constitutional cases such as Johnson v. McIntosh or Worcester versus Georgia. We are at a law school, so let me begin the courtroom campaign with the courtroom campaigns and suggest to you a half dozen or so of these battles that are worth studying for the lessons they tell us. And this is 3A. They'll all be discussed in great detail in the book. For this book, I've selected a number of legal conflicts from which I believe future briefcase warriors, whether Native American or not, can learn a great deal. These include the cases in colonial New England in which tribal Indians are subjected to local courts and forced into, quote, voluntary integration in the community. Experiences of southeastern Indian tribes in the forcible adaptation of elements of the Anglo-American legal system. Use of military court-martials, such as those in the trial and execution of 38 Santee Sioux during the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln's role in the largest mass hanging in American history in Minnesota on the day after Christmas. Great Lakes fishing right cases and their companion cases in the Northwest. The trial of Standing Bear and his battle to establish native rights and citizenship. The struggle of the Black and Freedmen Seminoles, and now Cherokees, to share in the claims payment and membership in their tribes. Hanging Judge Parker and the role of the federal courts in early territorial conflicts in tribal jurisdiction. The role of the courts in the Crazy Snake Rebellion, fought against the Dawes Allotment Act. Corruption of state judicial systems and the curative intervention of the federal government in the Osage oil murders. And finally, the highly controversial question of politics, justice, and presidential pardons in the Leonard Peltier murder conviction and his imprisonment. Pardon me for a slightly sarcastic aside. If the Indian community had only known what President Clinton needed to grant a pardon, we could have found a few $1 million and freed Peltier just like the other 14 people that Clinton pardoned in his last hours in office. Let me focus also on one of what I regard as monumentally significant legal battles at this moment. The struggle of Indian stereotypes, the use of Native American sports mascots and Indian images. People often say to me, why do you give a damn about a sports mascot? There is a specific reason relating to Indian law that this is a crucial issue. Indian people under the trust responsibility doctrine, unlike any other group, Fighting Irish or Viking or whatever, have decisions about their life and their land made by individuals other than themselves. And if Congress and if the executive branch believes and is influenced by outdated stereotypes when they make educational decisions for Indian people, when they make land use for Indian people, they are making those decisions not on the reality of the world as it is, but on a false image of the world. They do not realize that there are at least 3,000 Native Americans who are lawyers. They do not know that the first woman involved in the creation of a rocket for outer space was Mary Ross. Such misconceptions would be funny, but for the impact these myths have upon Indian people and the individual lives. This is why I regard this as one of the key Indian law issues, why this to me continues to be crucial. Take the case of Raymond Nakai, the Navajo flutist. I've never been sure whether it's a flutist or a flautist. But anyway, he was the first American Indian to win an Emmy for his work. He's performed with all of the great orchestras around the world. Nakai recalls his experience in being judged by false images in a letter that he wrote. I spent time studying and preparing, knowing a little bit about music theory. We decided that maybe I should try my hand at getting into a music school. So we wrote a letter to Juilliard. 2 band leaders in high school, the tribal music leaders, all wrote letters. And different people in the tribe wrote letters in my support. We were very hopeful. We thought it would be good for me to go to Juilliard. And then a letter came back saying that although my grade point average and everything else was good, I think the letter said, Mr. Nakai would be very hard pressed and would find it difficult to survive in our school of music because American Indians do not have a music culture to speak of. Nakai continues. And I thought, wait a minute now. We have all the ceremonial music, we have all the social songs, and things very much like folk cultures of other people around the world. There's a problem here. So I think much of what I do now is because I need to show people that my culture is important. The culture of music that I inhabit in my own traditional world and the world I am working in today is an actual rendition of how I see myself using a philosophy of music with which to communicate. Hopefully, as far as we know, the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo did not tell the Osage sisters, Marjorie and Maria Tallchief, that there was no Native American dance tradition before they merged their native heritage with the European ballet tradition. Incidentally, some of you may know that both of Marjorie's 2 sons are practicing Indian lawyers. And Peggy Lee always claimed that Lee Wiley, the Native American jazz diva, was the greatest influence on her singing style. In conclusion, I'm struck by the similarity of a letter from the Sioux artist Oscar Howe and how much it is like the one from Raymond Nakai. The letter was written in 1959 after one of Howe's paintings was rejected by white judges at an Indian art show. The work was excluded because the painting, quote, was non-Indian and embodied a non-traditional Indian painting style. Howe responded, "There is much more to Indian art than pretty stylized pictures. There was also power and strength and individualism, emotional and intellectual insight. In the old Indian paintings, every bit in my painting is a true studied art and act of Indian painting. Are we to be held back forever with one phase of Indian painting? Are we to be held back forever with no right to individualism, dictated to as Indians always have been, put on a reservation and treated like a child, and only the white man knows what is best for him? Now, even in art, you little child, do what we think is best for you, do nothing else." Well, I'm not going to stand for it. Indian art can compete with any art in the world, but not as suppressed art. I see so much of the mismanagement and mistreatment of my people. It makes me cry inside to look at these people. My father died on the reservation about 3 years ago in a little shack. My two brothers still live there in that shack. Never enough to eat, never enough clothing, treated as second-class citizens. This is one of the reasons I have tried to keep the fine ways and culture of my forefathers alive. But one could easily turn to become a social protest painter. I only hope the art world will not be one more contributor to holding Indians in chains. Howe exemplifies what is meant by paintbrush warrior. He has been one of many Native artists, writers, musicians who use their talent to wage the Indian battle for survival. One of the reasons I was so delighted to be here this week is that George Longfish is being honored on campus, and there is an exhibition of his work. The third chapter in Tonto's Revenge, I snuck this in as a fourth book, is dedicated in many ways to George. It's called You Can't Roller Skate in a Buffalo Herd, Even If You Have All the Medicine, which is one of his great paintings. False images and common misconceptions confront Indians on a daily basis. To inject a personal example, I've spent my life responding or not responding to the question, but you don't look like an Indian. Commander Harrington recalls upon his return from space, among the first questions he was asked, did you grow up on a real reservation? And how much Indian are you really? In response to the pale-faced assertions of not looking like an Indian, I wish I had been as gutsy or clever to come up with the response of the Smithsonian's Native American folklorist Raina Green. Her reply to persons who assert, you don't look like an Indian is, and you don't look rude either. On a more serious contemporary note, the United Nations is now rightly focused on the dangers of biological warfare. It is ironic, in the light of the United States history, that smallpox remains the most frequently discussed disease in the modern germ warfare arsenal. More Native people died of smallpox than were killed in all the military battles combined. There's a smoking gun in the official letter of policy written by Lord Jeffrey Amherst ordering germ warfare. There's a stronger piece of evidence that European powers and later the United States used smallpox as a weapon of war as well. For example, official government documents record the fatal action to provide smallpox inoculation for tribal members. Despite treaty obligations of the trustee to inoculate, few Indians were ever protected against the smallpox epidemics. And this at a time when the United States systematically inoculated all frontier soldiers. Perhaps you think medical atrocities are historic, limited to 18th and 19th century policy. It is easy to believe that such conduct was long ago reputed. Not so. And that is one of the reasons we need more briefcase warriors. The record is clear. The Indian Health Service involuntarily sterilized Native American women. This occurred as recently as the 1960s, 1970s, and into the early 1980s. One of my Indian law students and current doctoral candidate, Donna Ralston Lewis, gathered the data. It is hard and clear and overwhelming. Decisions to sterilize were routinely made at Indian hospitals across the Indian country. From 1973 to 1976, a General Accounting Office study investigating 4 of 12 Indian Health Service hospitals revealed that 3,406 Indian women were sterilized. Former Dakota Senator Jim Abarisk argued that considering the small number of Native Americans in the population, sterilizing 3,406 Indian women would be comparable to sterilizing 452,000 white women. The 500-year war continues in both courtroom and operating room, and lawyers trained in Native American law are among our key warriors. The University of Montana Law School has for at least 4 decades been a training ground in this struggle for justice for Native people. And at last, really in conclusion, one of the greatest joys in my professional life was introducing my chief, Wilma Mankiller, at the AALS annual meeting speaker in 1995. She remains the only head of state ever to address the Association of American Law Schools. With Chief Mankiller's help, I'd like to close this lecture with the question of survival and a look at the future. I firmly believe, Chief Mankiller predicts, that 500 years from now, there will be strong Native people in the Americas where ancient languages, ceremonies, and songs will be heard. I share Chief Mankiller's optimism. I thank you for what the University of Montana and your law school has done and will continue to do to advance this Native American dream. I deeply appreciate this opportunity to share my thoughts with you. May all our wars of the next 500 years be fought with book and not bow, with courtroom as a primary battlefield for the challenging of historic injustices by our modern Native American briefcase warriors. Thank you.
For those of you who have questions, if you could please stand to ask your question and wait for a microphone so you can speak into it. So, I was reading one of your articles before this lecture, and you spoke of, I think it was Justice Scalia's misunderstanding in the case,
Smith case.
Smith case, and the misunderstanding of a very, very important part of religion and culture. And when we took a class with Professor Smith earlier this year, we talked a lot about Native American law clerks and how that could increase understanding of the issues that these.
There's, to my knowledge, never been
Right,
a Native
so
American who's clerked for the court.
What are your thoughts on that issue?
Let me tell you the story, because it's a quite remarkable story, and it appeared, I put it in print for the first time. The University of Pennsylvania, 2 or 3 years ago, did an exhibit of the masterworks from their historic Indian collection. And they selected 75 people or so and sent each of us a picture of a particular work of art. And you were not supposed to describe the work of art. You were supposed to say what this could tell people. And I got a copy, a picture of an Osage peyote roadman's box, which is used in the Native American church. It's a beautiful work of art. And so I said to them, I will write about the Smith case, which you may know was a peyote case. It was an Oregon case, as a matter of fact. My president was the Attorney General at the time they brought the case. Anyway, Scalia writes the opinion, and he finds it's perfectly all right to have wine, sacramental wine in the Catholic Church, but it's not right to have peyote because these aren't real religious groups. And so I contrasted that with a story that Cal Woodard, the great legal historian, told me. He and Scalia lived on the same street in Charlottesville when Scalia taught at the University of Virginia. And they had children who were the same age. Of course, being my sarcastic self, anyone who has children who are the same age as Scalia's. Scalia has, I think, 11 children. So Cal and Scalia were one fall going to go out walking in the Blue Ridge Mountains. They were taking Cal's 3 children and 3 of Scalia's out to walk. It was the fall. And so Cal said that they were walking along, and Scalia just became, just excited. Said, stop, 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 stop. We've got to do something. We've got to do something. And Cal turned around and he said, what's the matter? And Scalia said, there's a snake, a snake, a snake. And Cal, who was just a lovely, lovely man, said, it's a black snake. Kill it, kill it, kill it, Scalia says. And Cal said, it's not as if he's in our backyards on Rugby Road in Charlottesville. We are in his backyard. And of course, by this time, the snake's gone on its way. It didn't know. I prefer to believe it didn't know. It was Scalia. Because I would have expected him to stay and bite had he known. But I think that's Stephen Vincent Benet in his unfinished poem. I conclude on his epic poem of America, has a wonderful line in which he says, and the woman knocked the cutworm from the vine, and she crushed it under her heel because it knew not God, and she and her descendants were to rule in New England and in America. So, that's the kind of people, in some cases, the briefcase warriors have to appear before and try to persuade. But in answer to your question, which I didn't plant, yes, I think it would be wonderful to have a Native American clerk for the Supreme Court. And I think once it occurred, it would start occurring again. But if you look at the breakdown of where Supreme Court clerks come from with regard to their legal education, it's a very narrow range of law schools. Well, I think I'll have to answer, but we also have a little reception, do we?
We do. There's a class in here in just a few minutes, so I would invite all of you to join us in the Pope Room. We have a reception and some nice treats for everybody to enjoy, and we thank you all for coming so much.
And I'll be there to answer any
Yes,
questions.
Professor Strickland will be there.
My pleasure.